And we're crossing to Marrakesh, where Godfrey is standing by. Of course, he's attending the annual African Development Bank group meetings on that end. Good afternoon, Godfrey.
Indeed, so we are back in Marrakesh. I can tell you it's holiday time here. Everything moves slowly. If you saw with our debate earlier, Alicia, we were delayed by a very long time because, things move a little slower. But anyway, we're now joined here on our set by the Minister and the President's Minister Trevor Manuel, and we're talking, of course, the involvement of the private sector and funding some of those key challenges around infrastructure that we've heard so much about at these 2013 meetings of the African Development Bank. Minister, thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Godfrey.
There's been a lot of talk here about the funding needs for Africa's infrastructure development. We know that governments do not have money, and we know that the private sector does have money. But we do know also, though, that the private sector needs certain conditions for it to be able to invest. To what extent, from where you stand, do you see private sector participation and being addressed from the government side in getting my private money in?
Well, I think one of the issues that we must address as part of this is the government's revenue-raising capability. And in many African countries, mining rights have been given away effectively without being able to levy royalties or taxes.
Spoken like a true finance minister.
But that's a big problem. So if countries don't have the revenue, they can't even match private sector flows, and they become dependent in spite of the fact that enormous revenues have been extracted from the country. I mean, I want to mention an example because I think it's so patently bad.
Sure.
And that is what's happened in Guinea-Conakry with iron ore, where an individual got rights, and I think he says he paid $230 million. Right. He sold it for $2.5 billion. He sold 50% of it for $2.5 billion, and nothing, not a dime accrues to the state, the people. And so when the country needs money for infrastructure, they have to go elsewhere. So dealing with corruption and ensuring that there are flows out of the mineral resources, I think, is the beginning. Beyond that, I think that governments will have to borrow some, sure, but also there needs to be matching of the private sector resources to develop infrastructure. We can't delay this any longer. Part of what we need as well is something, again, one of those things that we've signed, the tripartite agreement that we've signed, SADC, COMESA and the East African Community opens enormous possibilities for us, but we need the infrastructure to be able to deliver intra-African trade. And right now the resources aren't there, so we will need a lot of private sector resources to back it. We must package the project in a way where the private sector have certainty about what happens for them, and the African Development Bank has led with this. It has selected 10 projects to lead with. That hasn't met everybody's fancy. It was a matter for discussion at the AU just this past weekend. But we need something that's cross-border that we can start with, that provides tangible benefits. The private sector will know, and our people will know the change is on the way.
Now, we know the African Development Bank is beginning to look in this direction. So they are talking about raising the infrastructure bond fund across the African continent. But we also know that there are other sources of money that have not been tapped. People have spoken about the issue of the Diaspora funds that potentially could be a source of funding for African infrastructure. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, we've seen the Diaspora Fund work incredibly well for countries like India. They've raised billions and billions through it, largely because they've been able to retain a strong bond between Indians living abroad and the country. We need the same, and so we need a pan-African venture. The African Development Bank is very well positioned to do that, and we must have a single African message. It does mean that countries have to kind of take a step back, allowing a pan-African venture to take root.
Now, some people in government in Africa have been suggesting that governments have actually been moving faster than the private sector in trying to finance infrastructure. To what extent do you think governments ought to be actually incentivizing, though, the private sector so it also moves faster in tandem with government?
You know, public infrastructure, government can never absolve itself or devolve the responsibility for public infrastructure and the provision of the big infrastructure issues, roads and logistics support, rail, energy, water will still largely be the responsibility of governments. It can outsource some of the responsibility, but governments have to retain the political responsibility and the accountability, which is why government must always be there ahead and negotiating with the private sector, because if you don't, the impoverishment of poor Africans is going to happen in leaps and bounds. I mean, there's an ad about water that says water in most African slums is a lot more expensive than the very expensive bottled water that film stars drink. And that's what we need to change. And you can only change it if you have strong government interested in the daily lives of people.
Yeah. We are, of course, at the African Development Bank meetings where we talk Pan-African issues. Here, Minister, you launched the National Development Plan. You're in charge of that plan now. Are there elements within that plan that allow you to talk about infrastructure development across the region, across the continent?
Well, the position of South Africa on the African continent, the way in which we relate to our neighbours, the development of regional economic communities are a fundamental part of that. And that work we're doing in the context of NEPAD, but it must find resonance within the National Development Plan. And, we can never cut ourselves off. We can never cut ourselves off from our neighbours, so that becomes an ongoing issue. If one looks at the fact that there's the expansion of the Lesotho Highlands development water project, in part to supply Gauteng with water. It's cross-border, but it's also fundamentally linked to our needs in South Africa. What we need to tie that with is a campaign to save water, reduce the losses of water, because in Gauteng much too much money is spent on paying for water that just drains into the soil, because the water reticulation system is as old as it is.
Absolutely. Minister, thanks very much indeed for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Indeed, back to you in the studio, Alicia. Minister Trevor Manuel, Minister in the President's, talking about the National Development Plan and, of course, some of the key themes that have dominated these meetings here in Marrakesh.